More good news. Despite facing headwinds, South Africa has retained its #2 spot in terms of investment attractiveness in Africa. RMB's 8th edition of Where to Invest in Africa report emphasizes the need for efficient infrastructure. Let's find out more. I'm joined by co-author of that report, an analyst at RMB Africa, Neville Mandemika, via Skype. Neville, thanks for your time. We appreciate it. South Africa, #2 again in terms of investment attractiveness. First, tell us how this is measured.
So we've got a very simple but I would say elegant methodology. And, we look at two things. Number one, economic activity as the one pillar. And secondly, we look at the operating environment. The reason why we went for this methodology is to say, we often talk about high growth rates in Africa, but we often don't talk about how easy it is to actually do business. Hence, we selected this particular methodology. So based on that, we found that, Egypt retained the #1 spot in this current edition. And we saw it, toppling South Africa in last year's edition. So, despite some of the things that we've seen, there is, the proverbial light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak.
Yeah. Now, we seem to be the investment hotspot currently. Is the president making all the right moves, would you say?
Yeah, I think, some of the Ramaphosa effect that we've seen, I think it's starting to bear fruit in some sense. The $100 billion investment drive that is on, we've seen some track record on that. But, if we look at our rankings, it's a comparative analysis. So, are they doing enough relative to an Egypt, which is in #1? I heard you earlier talking about Moody's, revising the growth forecast to just under 1%. In Egypt, they're growing at 4%. So are we doing enough to actually continue to hold that coveted spot of, #2 and hopefully pushing up to #1 in the next few years?
Yeah, so tell us what Egypt is actually doing right that we aren't. How do we get to #1?
So if you look at what Egypt is doing right, like I mentioned, the 4% economic growth is actually outweighing the operating environment that we have, which is particularly good. So if you look at the ease of doing business, I mean, we are head and shoulders above most economies in Africa. But what is really weighing down on us is the economic growth. So, hopefully we get a lot more revision upwards in terms of forecasted economic growth. But that has to really escalate quite quickly for us to topple, some economies such as Egypt, which are really pushing ahead in terms of the economic and structural reform that we're seeing in that part of the continent.
Now, the report found no real improvements in operating environments across Africa. What are we missing here?
Yeah, so there are a few concerns. I mean, if we look at a few countries, issues such as liquidity challenges and structural reform, these are some of the things that are still weighing down on the operating environment, as well as some political sort of flare-ups that we saw. I mean, in Southern Africa alone, we had quite a few political changes, most of them for good, but again, that breeds into quite a fair bit of uncertainty, and we're seeing some of those challenges here. So, the sooner economic headlines continue to actually make the front page of the newspapers, I think the better off we are, and less politics, particularly the bad brand, if I can call it that.
And lastly, you also reckon the focus has to be on efficient infrastructure. Tell us why.
Okay. Well, if we look at the survey that we tend to conduct, the second most problematic factor that we see is infrastructure. So if, for example, in some instances or countries where you actually want to move your goods from point A to point B, it is particularly difficult because the roads are bad or electricity shortages, etc. So we tend to find that that is an impediment for businesses that actually want to establish their presence in Africa. So that's why we chose to actually focus on this particular issue, hard and soft infrastructure across Africa, because this will be, the thing that actually catapults, Africa's growth rates, into double-digit growth, if I can call it that, over the next few years, particularly if we get this right.
All right, thank you so much for your time and your insight. Appreciate it. That was analyst at RMB Africa, Neville Mandemika.